Yeah, it's exciting. So going into the doctrine of divine simplicity, could you talk a little bit about like just like the basics of what it is? And I guess before that, you could talk about like what got you interested in the doctrine of divine simplicity.
Okay, so yeah, what got me interested in it was two things. Like originally, I just wanted to know more about the classical tradition. I was trying to understand the classical doctrine of God. If I wanted to know that, then simplicity is part of the package deal of classical theism. Another thing that happened, it was this incident during my PhD. So when I was studying during my PhD, I was asked to give a talk for the theology seminar, just kind of giving my reflections on the doctrine of divine simplicity. And so as I was giving my talk, there was this one person in the audience that was actually the moderator for the talk that was being incredibly rude, just like kept rolling his eyes over and over again as I'm presenting, and then scoffed so much that everybody in the audience like started getting really distracted. And so I had to pause and say, "Do you need a glass of water?" A few years later, the person kind of sort of apologized for that behavior. But what struck me about that incident, like when it first happened, was this is a doctrine that like is really obscure, like hardly anybody's heard of it. And I had this kind of prediction that like it's going to make a big comeback and people are going to be really up in arms about how why we need it to such an extent they're going to be like openly like mocking anybody who denies it. And so I was like, okay, that's weird. I need to look at this more. And it turned out I was right. The prediction was right. Like it really is the case that people had this renewed interest in the doctrine. So that's kind of what originally got me interested in it. But then like, what is it though? Well, so simplicity, as far as I can tell, is a very strong claim that I think a lot of people miss just exactly how strong it is. So first claim is typically that it says like God has no parts. But then what counts as a part? Look, all sorts of things count as parts. So the way you typically see it articulated is that all of God's attributes and actions are identical to each other. So think of God's like omnipotence and his omniscience. Those are supposed to be identical to each other and then identical to God's existence. From there, you look at all of God's actions. So his action to create the universe, his action to send like Jesus to become incarnate, his action for answering your prayer from Sunday night. All of those are identical to each other, such that there's only one divine act. And that one divine act is identical to God's existence. So God's act of answering your prayer on Sunday night is identical to God's existence. But simplicity goes further than that. Simplicity says that God does not have any properties at all. And sometimes I hear people say things like, well, God has like, these Cambridge properties or something. But I'm like, well, hang on. Simplicity says no properties whatsoever. And this is really explicit. So when you look at people like James Dozel, Catherine Rogers, Jeff Brower, Mike Bergman, Augustine, Peter Lombard, and so many others, they are very explicit that God does not have any properties, any universals, no forms, no tropes, and not even accidental properties like being creator, Lord, or judge of all men. And you might think it's kind of odd to say like, well, God can't have the property of being creator, but that is exactly what like Augustine and Peter Lombard and Aquinas say. And then John Scotus actually says like accidental properties are repugnant to the simple God. Now it goes a little bit further though. So simplicity also says that God has no potential whatsoever. Instead, God is like pure actuality. And again, that's not all though. Like simplicity wants to go a little bit further. So simplicity says that because everything that is in God is identical to God, there are no distinctions to be made in God. And so this is why someone like James Dozel will say you cannot have distinct logical moments in the life of God. But then simplicity also seems to entail that even conceptual distinctions like cannot be made of God. And so Anselm, James Arminius, and Catherine Rogers are really explicit that you cannot even make conceptual distinctions in the simple God. And what's going on here is there's this kind of medieval assumption in the background that whatever can be divided in your mind, you could divide in reality. And so I'll further also, when you think about the identity claims itself, like if you really think about those, like there's nothing that in God that could ground your conceptual distinctions. And which is why when you look at different theologians like Aquinas or Moses Amarat, they'll say things like, well, I just made a bunch of distinctions in my theology, but like those distinctions really exist in my head alone. They don't actually apply to the divine reality itself. And then you'll even see these arguments based on the denial of conceptual distinctions to try to get to like attributes like timelessness or divine aseity. So this denial of conceptual distinctions, it's actually really crucial for a lot of different moves that classical theists want to make. So this is why I started out saying I think this doctrine is really, really radical. It's really strong, and people often miss how radical it is.
Yeah, it does seem kind of like almost just kind of a little bizarre. But so, say like under divine simplicity and like God's act to maybe like send Christ like die for our sins would be like identical to God's act of maybe like healing someone in some sort of like physical capacity. Is that something entailed by the doctrine?
Yeah, so all of God's acts, whichever acts you want to talk about, they're all identical to each other. So there's one act, and then that one act is identical to God's existence. And so you'll see people like Bonaventure will say like God's act of creating, sustaining, providentially guiding the universe, all of that stuff. It's all identical to God. They're identical to each other, such as one act, and it's all identical to God. So God just is his act of creating, sustaining, providentially guiding, you name it.